Welcome to the CHC podcast. We are a ministry of the Christian Heritage Center. The mission of the CHC is to honor, preserve, and learn from the heritage of godly figures in the past to better serve the church today. My name is Kyle Kirby. I'm your host today. I'm pastor for preaching at Grace Fellowship Church in Albion, Illinois, and I'm also the founder of the Christian Heritage Center. Today, I have the privilege of sitting down with a wonderful guest who has willingly given of his time. And so we're very grateful for Pastor Matthew Everhard to be with us. And so we're going to speak about our forefather in the faith, Jonathan Edwards. So for those of you who might be unfamiliar with him, Jonathan Edwards was a towering figure in the 18th century. He lived from 1703 to 1758. He's often regarded as the greatest American theological mind that's ever been produced. He lived a life captivated by the glory of God, and he lived in the joy of knowing Christ. He was converted in 1721. He went on to pastor in Northampton, Massachusetts, where God used his preaching to awaken hearts and spark revival in the First Great Awakening. He's commonly and most notably recognized for his sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, but it's often overlooked and neglected that Edwards also powerfully proclaimed the beauty and the sweetness and the majesty of Christ Jesus. He emphasized that true religion is heartfelt delight in God. Through his influential writings, such as Religious Affections and The End for Which God Created the World, Edwards showed that the enjoyment of God is the soul's ultimate happiness. And so today we're going to delve into the life, the legacy, and the ministry of Jonathan Edwards. Brother, thank you so much for being here and taking part in this.
Well, thanks for having me on. It's a real honor to be here today. I'm very excited to talk with you, Kyle. I think this is going to be a great conversation. I definitely love Jonathan Edwards, and I love the God that Jonathan Edwards served. And I'm really excited for some of the things that Edwards wrote and spoke about during his ministry, trying to learn from him for a number of years myself now. And it's been a real pleasure to be a student of Jonathan Edwards. So should be a great conversation. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate that.
Oh, pleasure's all mine. I'm grateful you're here. Could you, brother, could you briefly introduce yourself and a little bit about share as much or as little as you want?
Mhm.
And then also, could you share how you were first introduced to Jonathan Edwards?
Yeah, great question. So, first, as to myself, my name is Matthew Everhard, and I'm one of the pastors here at Gospel Fellowship PCA. We are a Reformed Bible believing church just north of Pittsburgh. So, if you're anywhere in the north of Pittsburgh area, please come check us out. I'd love to have you in worship with us. We have worship at 8:30 and 11 o'clock on the Lord's Day, Sunday school in
Mm,
between 9:45. And I'm also an adjunct professor at RPTS, the Reformed Presbyterian Theological Seminary, right in the heart of Pittsburgh. So if you're looking to go to school somewhere, we'd love to have you in class at some point, rpts.edu. Um, thanks for having me on again. I kind of really delved into Jonathan Edwards at a period in my life where I needed something. I needed joy in my life.
mm,
And I was working a pastoral call at Faith Church in Brooksville, Florida at that time, feeling a lot of stress in my personal life, feeling a lot of stress at work,
mm,
feeling a lot of stress in my doctoral studies. And I came to that moment where every doctoral student has to pick something to study for their dissertation project. And I got some really good advice from Steve Childers at RTS Orlando. He said, when you pick a dissertation topic, pick something that your soul needs,
mm,
something that when they do your
mm,
funeral years from now, that they'll look back and they'll say that topic changed his life. And I
mm,
looked at my life and I thought, well, I'm going to analyze myself. I'm going to look for the fruit of the spirit in my life. And I came to love first because that's
mm,
listed first in Galatians 5:22. And I realized, well, I love the Lord. I really do. I love my wife. I love my church, my kids. And so I went on to joy, and it hit
mm,
me right there that I was lacking in joy. And so I thought, I want to study joy, and I'm going to sit then, therefore, at the feet of the theologian of joy,
Hmm.
who I was learning to be, Jonathan Edwards.
Mm,
And so for my doctoral studies dissertation project, I read through most of the major works of Edwards, the minor works, the treatises, the personal writings, the letters, just
mm,
looking for themes of joy and happiness everywhere, highlighting them, circling them, trying to make connections, and eventually wrote my project on a theology of joy, Jonathan Edwards, and
mm,
eternal happiness in the Holy Trinity.
mm.
So that was back in 2014, 15, and 16. And so that was sort of my introduction to Edwards as almost an obsessive study subject for my life. That's borne a lot of fruit since.
Oftentimes that happens when you're consumed with something. Oh
Hmm.
man. So so obviously he's had a great influence on you, and so we think about Edwards himself. What were some of the influences? Because I think a lot of people, they think about Edwards in the midst of the Great Awakening, um, and this full-grown man, this ministry, his preaching. They know his preaching was different than Whitfield. It wasn't Whitfield. They know there's some differences there. But what was his early life like? And what were some of those early influences that kind of shaped him and molded him into the man and the minister that he would become later on?
Yeah, great question. Well, just to frame up Edwards historically in context, his life, as you mentioned earlier, 1703 to 1758, we can situate that about halfway between the Salem witch trials in the
Mm,
1690s, which he was not a part of. Some people mistakenly think he was, not at
mm,
all, nothing to do with that. And then the American Revolution in
mm,
1776, which he did not live to see. So his life is between those two dates. And as to his early life, his childhood, he is one of about 10 children in his family, mostly sisters he had. And so the most formative influence in his young life is undoubtedly his father, the Reverend Timothy Edwards, who
mm,
was also a pastor as well as a military chaplain at that time. And so Edwards was reared by Timothy Edwards, his father, to be an excellent thinker
mm,
and to become the pastor theologian that he would become. So we could say that um, Timothy's influence was. I would stop short of saying all controlling, but he had a very heavy influence in Edwards's thinking and writing. And even as Edwards begins to come into his own as a young thinker, let's say when he's 17, 18, 19, 20 years old, he's still very concerned to
mm,
honor his father. And we see that, for instance, in his resolutions that he writes when he's 19 and 20 years old. He's very concerned to have his father's approval. And interestingly enough,
mm,
his father held to that Puritan soteriological morphology, two couple big words there, sorry about that, in which they thought that salvation occurred by a series of steps.
mm,
Namely, a person would come under conviction of the law and then have kind of a striving to obey the law, but falling back. They called this process legal terrors. And then finally, some light would come into the soul, and then finally, conversion and regeneration.
mm,
Well, Timothy did not think Edwards, his son, was converted for some time. And so he really didn't even become a full communicant member until much later than we would think for a pastor's kid.
mm,
So you mentioned his conversion dated about 1721. I think that's probably right.
mm,
But certainly Edwards wanted to please his father. He
mm,
desired to be a godly man, a good scholar, and there's every indication that Edwards took his education very seriously as a young man,
mm,
and that his life trajectory was certainly one of the mind. He loved to write, think, and then, of course, to pray, to teach, and to publish later on.
mm.
So that would be how I'd sum up his young adult life.
It's interesting you mentioned his that's one of the areas I've benefited from Edwards is his theology of preparationism.
Hmm.
Essentially, it has been tremendously helpful in thinking through that. And how do you deal with what we might call seekers?
Hmm. Hmm.
That has been really helpful for me.
Hmm.
Um, his it's not Edwards' work, but rational biblical. Oh, who wrote it? I've got it right on my shelf behind me. Um, Sproul's mentor.
Oh, Gerstner, yeah.
Yes, Gerstner's Rational Biblical Theology of Edwards.
Hmm.
And he has a whole section on that. It's so helpful.
Hmm.
Um, so he was converted, and then he how did that transition into a time of theological preparation for ministry and entrance into ministry?
Right. So, in some sense, Edwards was raised to be a pastor. And in those days, of course, the minister was considered the most esteemed person in most towns or societies, certainly the most educated. And Timothy's designs for his son Jonathan were all along that Edwards would be reared theologically and trained with the most precise thinking available
Mm,
and reading the best resources available at that time. So Edwards goes to Yale to take his bachelor's degree. Later on, he's going to also take a master's degree also from Yale. And in between that, there's going to be one formative experience where Jonathan Edwards goes off to New York City to take a pastorate, a Presbyterian pastorate, interestingly enough,
mm,
in which his mission is to try to reconcile a church split, which he adequately does, thus working himself out of a job.
mm,
And so during that time, though, in New York City, he really has sort of an idyllic spiritual experience. And he really loves the service to the church, the work of preaching. He's not yet fully ordained. That's not going to come until a little bit later. But he basically took what we might call an interim pastor job or pulpit supply type position. And from there, after he takes his master's degree, then there's going to be another kind of false start at the city of Bolton, Connecticut, where it looks like he's going to become their pastor. And for some reason, we're not sure why, maybe because Timothy, his father, there might have been some disagreement on the fittedness of that call
mm,
for Edwards, doesn't end up taking that position, goes back, does a little tutoring at Yale, and then ultimately his first real significant pastoral work is going to be when he's called to be the assistant pastor of his own maternal grandfather, Solomon Stoddard, at the
mm,
Northampton Church, which is about as significant of a early congregational church as far west as really kind of pressing the boundaries at that point. Of course,
mm,
Boston is where all the action is on the East Coast. But anyways, he's going to take this assistant pastoral position under Solomon Stoddard, who is aged at this point, but highly revered as one of the most important theologians of the time. Probably second only to the Mathers back in Boston.
mm,
Solomon Stoddard is really influential, and Edwards is going to go and become his assistant pastor, which he will do for a couple years until Solomon Stoddard will eventually die. I think he
mm,
was about 90 some years old
mm,
and sharp to the very end. He never lost his mental faculties. He just ended up, getting exhausted and died.
mm,
And so then Edwards is essentially the sole pastor then of the Northampton Church,
mm,
where he's going to serve faithfully for 23 years of ministry, giving really his best early efforts to that Northampton Church. And that's probably where we think of him as being a pastor for most of his vocational career.
mm. So did when he became an assistant to Solomon Stoddard, did he immediately? How often would he preach? Was he doing primarily um, visitation and counseling, or how? Like, what did that look like for him?
Well, there's a little bit of question there. So here's what we know about Northampton Church and most churches in that time is that they would typically have two services on the Lord's Day. You'd have your morning service followed by a break, and then you'd have your afternoon service. And then most churches also likewise would have a Thursday afternoon, what they would call the lecture.
Mm,
And so most Puritan, colonial, Calvinistic congregational churches would have at least three preaching services per week, including those. But then there would also be pastoral visitation and so
mm,
forth, as well as other administrative duties and such.
mm,
And so basically, what's happening is as Solomon Stoddard is growing weary of body, not so much of mind,
mm,
Edwards is basically taking up those responsibilities. And so covering for his grandfather from time to time, learning the ropes. But here's one thing that's really interesting,
mm,
Kyle, is though we don't have all of Edwards's early sermons, There are some gaps and things that we don't have from him, though there's a lot to study. One thing that's really interesting is that his early sermons are very excellent.
Hmm.
The learning curve was really steep for Edwards really quickly, and so
Hmm.
some of his earliest sermons are still absolutely exceptional.
Hmm.
And this is probably because Edwards was raised hearing multiple excellent sermons from his own
Yeah.
father Timothy, and as well as benefiting from his grandfather's incredible legacy. So Edwards just has this incredible ability to write his sermons and to preach them even from a young time on.
Hmm.
We have some of his sermons from, let's say, the New York period, and they're really good. In fact,
Hmm.
if you were to compare them to later on, the common reader might not even notice, like, hey, this guy's really young here. It's just really good from very early on, and he picked up all of that, not only
Hmm.
because he's born with incredible
Yeah.
genius level giftedness, but also because he was just reared to be that guy.
Hmm.
So his influences were pretty profound in his life.
Hmm. Yeah, I can imagine. I feel like with Edwards, with such giftedness and such intellectual ability, um, I'm always amazed when I read an Edwards sermon how practical they are.
Hmm.
Yes, are they theologically weighty? Absolutely. But they're also very practical. Um, Whenever you think about Edwards' preaching style and his preaching in general, um, how would you describe that balance in him? The theological preciseness and the theological weight of the message balanced with the pastoral heart and the practicality of the message for the
Hmm.
people.
Yeah, good question. So Edwards inherits a certain style of preaching that he's going to make his own.
Hmm.
Here's what the typical sermon would look like. So, first of all, there would be assumed a high biblical literacy.
Hmm.
So, at the beginning of every colonial Puritan sermon is a section typically called the text.
Hmm.
And this is rather short. In Edwards's works, it's usually only 2 pages, maybe even one sometimes, in which Edwards is going to summarize the literary and redemptive historical context of the passage that he's about to preach on. So typically, this would be to frame up whatever series of verses Edwards is going to study, just putting them in their place in that particular book, in its genre, in its setting historically, as far as the history of redemption. That is incredibly brief because most people knew their Bibles very, very well. They were not entertained to death with all sorts of media and social media and so forth. They read their Bibles. It was the one book that everybody had, and not everybody even had a lot of books. So the Bible was just constantly being discussed. So, after a brief introduction to the text, then there would be a much larger section of the sermon called the doctrine. And here, Edwards, as well as Timothy, his father, as well as Solomon Stoddard and others, would typically lay out what doctrine they found in that text in their own words. And then that doctrine would be subdivided into various points so as to subcategorize that doctrine from various different perspectives. So that's typically about a third, maybe up to even half of the sermon itself. But then the largest section of most given sermons, you could find exceptions to this rule, but generally the largest section is called the application or the improvements of the
Hmm.
text. And here is where a really good Puritan sermon will apply that text
Hmm.
in practically every direction. They were amazing text applicators. That's really what
Hmm.
Puritan preaching does well. So you'd have some pretty
Hmm.
expected formula here, though. You would have usually an application of exhortation, which is like an encouragement to do something. You'd have an application of rebuke, which is where you're supposed to see sin in your life. You would have an application of edification, which is what you're supposed to learn from that text. And then very often, like an application of comfort as well. And there were several other rather expected formula there, but typically what they would do then is they would apply that doctrine in various ways to the life of the person. And in, for instance, like Timothy Edwards' sermons, there might be as many as 60 points or subpoints in the application, which is just huge, way, way more application than we give today.
Mm-hmm.
Most of it striking to the heart, to the
Mm-hmm.
mind, or to the life. And so Edwards is going to do very similarly as well. He too is always going to divide almost every single sermon I've ever seen of Edwards. And again, there might be some exceptions, but practically every one follows that formula: text, doctrine, application.
Mm-hmm. Now, as he preached those sermons, how would you characterize his delivery
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
of his messages? And from what
Yeah.
I can tell, there seemingly was a little bit of it, there was a little bit of change throughout his life on how he did that and how he delivered those and his practices and his habits. Um, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that and on his delivery and his, I guess you'd say, preaching style, we could
Sure.
say.
So, like most preachers, I think Edwards grew and matured
Mm,
over time. One thing that he recognized in himself, though, he did not have the complete command of his
mm,
material and of the moment and of his audience that, for instance, Solomon Stoddard has. Now, Stoddard, his venerable grandfather, he is able to deliver hour to 2 hour long sermons without notes. And Solomon Stoddard believes that if a minister carries notes into the pulpit with him, it's something of a weakness that he should not need. His sermons too are very elegant and very structured.
mm,
They're definitely not just off the cuff, fly by the seat of your
mhm,
pants type constructions. But Solomon Stoddard is just so good at what he
mhm,
does that it's a little bit intimidating to Edwards.
mm,
So we can say that Edwards went through three major periods of life in his preaching. In the first period, his younger self, he writes out everything, full manuscripts, and he was aware that he was manuscript dependent in the pulpit. He thought of it as something that he wanted to get past, but he couldn't quite do it.
mm,
He is the kind of person that thinks better with a pen than with his mouth. He'll always kind of struggle with a
mm,
little bit of slowness of speech compared to his ability to think with his pen. So that's just how his brain works.
mm,
But in the Great Awakening in the 1740s, when George Whitefield comes through and Edwards hears Whitefield preach in his own
mm,
church, he has Whitefield come to visit at his home and preach at the Northampton church.
mm,
When he sees what Whitefield does, he's just blown away by the way
mm,
that Whitefield, with the power of the Spirit, has
mm.
just complete control of the moment, freedom of his
Yeah.
eloquence and expression, dynamic storytelling ability. And it seems obvious from that point on, when we look at the manuscripts of
Mm,
Edwards, that he was really trying to get a little bit of that freedom in the pulpit that he
mm,
just couldn't get in his earlier ministry. So
mm,
we notice this because his sermon outlines, which are really more like booklets, he made these little
mm,
booklets for himself.
mm,
They get a little bit looser and a little bit more paraphrastic and a little bit more outline-ish at about that point.
mm,
But then the third breaking point for Edwards, or breakthrough, I should say, is when he, and we're getting ahead of ourselves here a bit, when he's fired from the Northampton church and he goes to Stockbridge to be a missionary.
mm,
Now he feels real freedom because he doesn't have to be somebody. He has a very small English speaking church and a Native American church that he's pastoring.
mm,
And there, he repreaches some of his better stuff,
mm,
but he simplifies it for the sake of the Indians, the translator, the language barrier. He tells a lot more, not a lot, a little bit more stories, like parables, for instance,
mm,
related to the things that the Indians would have understood. And he seems to have really come into his own and
mm,
finally accepted himself as he really is and got comfortable with his own skin at that point.
mm.
So those are the kind of the three main iterations of Edwards as a preacher throughout the years.
Yeah, that's really neat. Do you have any encouragements, or do you have any thoughts for, say, young preachers, young men who are maybe aspiring to the ministry, or those who have just been in the ministry for a bit, with regards to that same area? Because I think people can get wrong ideas about what they should and shouldn't do, how early they should do those things. Because I know for myself, I preach predominantly with bare minimum outline.
Mhm.
But I started early in my ministry much more manuscript. And I think
Mhm.
for me, I could not have started with an outline because I didn't have the theological frameworks. I didn't have the accumulated knowledge and understanding. I didn't know my Bible as well. And so some of that for me progressively changed over time. What are your thoughts on that? And how would you encourage young ministers
Mhm.
in that area?
Well, I can only speak for myself, and I'm not sure that I would say I'm the best model, but I have really striven in my life to write out full manuscripts because, like Edwards, we're kind of kindred spirits here. Words don't always come naturally to me, just flying off the tongue. I'm a
Mm,
better thinker as I write ahead.
mm,
So I typically do not have brilliant insights just as I'm pontificating with my words out loud. I typically think better in my study by myself, poring
mm,
over my Bible
mm,
and my laptop, thinking through ideas. So I do still write out a full manuscript.
mm,
However, I will say this, there are two kinds of absolutely unbearable sermons that I can't stand. The first is when a man stands in the pulpit and reads me his
mm,
paper that he's written. I just think that that lacks the unction of the Spirit.
mm.
It's boring. It comes across very unnaturally and stilted, and it's not good verbal
Yeah.
communication. A sermon is, after all, a preached or oral medium, and it should
Mm,
be conveyed with the gravitas of the force of words, right?
mm,
On the other hand, the other kind of sermon that's absolutely unbearable for me is the kind of sermon where neither you nor the preacher has any idea where the sermon is going. The guy is just talking and he doesn't know where he's going to land the plane. You don't know where he's going to land the plane.
yeah.
He just kind of talks until time runs out. I think those are both terrible. And
Yeah.
so what I would do if I was a young preacher is I would encourage you to think very clearly in
Mm,
your manuscript, precisely in your
mm,
theological language and your use of scripture.
mm,
But then when you step into the pulpit, you want to try to step away from your manuscript, make direct eye contact with your
mhm,
people, and just speak to them with the help and the power of the Holy Spirit.
mm,
So that's kind of what I do. It's worked to some extent in my life, and I'm
mm,
thankful for it.
mm. I think there's also an element of, men have to know themselves and they need to understand who the Lord has made them to be,
Yeah, yeah.
and so like where are they at in life? Where are they at? Like how are they made up? What is their
Mm-hmm.
mind like?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so, yeah, that's really encouraging to see that progression in Edward. There's a story that, if I recall it correctly, when Whitfield came, his wife Sarah was sitting in the front, and she was weeping afterwards, I believe. And
Yeah,
there,
it's Edwards who weeps. Edwards
okay,
himself weeps. The now Sarah probably did too. She was greatly impressed with Whitfield, but the same was true in reverse. Whitfield was really impressed by their marriage. He
hmm,
thought they were the sweetest couple, and actually, after Whitfield comes through, he says in his journal that he's going to think about getting married himself. He's a single guy at this
mm,
point. So yeah, there's a mutual admiration society happening there. But Edwards wept the entire time Whitfield preached,
mm,
and he also had him come over. Well, he stayed at his house and he gave some private exhortations too. And Edwards would later say that he thought at least one or two of his children were saved
mm,
through Whitfield's preaching in that short
mm,
stint in Northampton. So they definitely impressed one another
mm,
during that first breeze through of Northampton on that preaching tour in I think 1740.
mm. Yeah, man, that's really encouraging. Um, did they meet more than once, or was it just the one time?
They met more than once and they corresponded as well. We have some letters which you can read. They're very interesting. They did have one bit of a tension moments, one or two. There's
Mm,
a moment where Whitfield, who seems to be a little bit moved more by what they called impressions in those days,
hmm,
which today some groups call them like a word of knowledge or something like that, where you feel like God's impressed something on your heart and then you try
hmm,
to obey that whim. Edwards is not sure that's a good idea. Whitfield talks about these impressions more often, and Edwards thinks it's misguided. So Edwards tries to gently rebuke him about that notion, and Whitfield appears to blow him off a bit. So there's a
mm,
little bit of tension that comes into their relationship. but for the most part, they still admired and respected each other.
Mm,
But I do recommend people to go and find their letters and read
mm,
their letters back and forth. If anyone's interested, they're in volume 16 of the works of Edwards, which we should say this, Kyle, at some point on this podcast. Everything Edwards ever wrote is free online at edwards.yale.edu. And you can go through all of the volumes of the Yale works for free with the correct pagination in the printed volumes and everything. Save
mm,
it to your drive or make
yeah.
yourself documents, whatever you want to do. It's all there for free. And his letters are in volume 16.
Mm, yeah. We'll definitely put that in the comments section of this because that is a huge resource.
Yep, totally
Um,
free. It's awesome.
man, that is awesome. It's incredible that that's all available and just sitting there to be used.
Yep.
So, what sermons during his time at Northampton did the Lord particularly bless? Um, were there? This is off the cuff memory, but was it a series on justification by faith that the Lord particularly blessed for a period, and then
Mm-hmm.
there was several other messages that seem to have been uniquely used of the Lord during times during the revival.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, so the revival actually comes in something like stages, or we might think of concentric circles. So if you imagine throwing a
Mm,
stone into the pond, you know how the circles kind of spray out. Well, it was 1735, 5 years before the main revival broke out, that Edwards's own congregation has a local
mm,
revival. And this is where he's going to write the book, A Faithful Narrative of What
mhm,
Happened in Northampton in 1735. It wasn't just the Northampton church, because there are other churches up and down the Connecticut River Valley in and related to Edwards's Hampshire Association of churches that he's
mm,
involved in. They all were experiencing revival in 1735. And you're correct. You know a lot about Edwards. This is you're really impressing me here. It was Edwards preaching on justification by faith that was part of that early 1735 local revival. Now, Edwards is not what we might call an expository preacher, where he
mm,
works through books of the Bible, like for instance, like a Calvin would be, just
mm,
preaching passage by passage. He didn't do that so much. He did do some expository series in chapters and things like that, but a lot of times he would kind of make up his own different kinds of series or do what we might consider standalone sermons. So
mm,
there's a bunch of these that are associated with the revival, both the 1735 revival and then the 40 to 42 revival, which is what we call the Great Awakening. It's really
mm,
kind of confined to 1740 to 42. There's a bunch of really good ones. Any good collection of Edwards' sermons
mm,
will feature some of them, but
yeah.
like A Divine and Supernatural Light
Oh,
would be a good one.
yeah.
God Justified in the Damnation of Sinners is another one.
Mm,
There's just so many. It's hard for me to pick anyone out, but probably the one that everybody knows about is Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God from
mhm.
1741. So that's an epochal moment for Edwards, and probably something we could talk about next if you want to go there.
Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah, let's go there.
Sorry, I didn't mean to jump ahead.
No, no, go ahead.
Well, so Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God is certainly not the only sermon that Edwards did on hell or justice or judgments or damnation or death, but it was used of God, and it does become kind of an emblematic moment of the Great
Mm,
Awakenings. This is a sermon that he actually did in his own home church in Northampton, and the people kind of shrugged it off. It was just another one of Pastor John's sermons.
mm,
But when he took it to Enfield, Connecticut,
mm,
which had at that point had not yet really embraced the flames of the revival in full force,
mm,
something incredible happened that night.
mm,
At least according to one account, Edwards might not have even been scheduled to preach that night.
mm,
But Edwards was the kind of guy that took what we might call pocket sermons with him when he was on the road. He had
mhm,
a series of sermons that he would re-preach from time to time. Anyways, he's called upon to preach at Enfield, and he preaches this sermon on a text from Deuteronomy: their foot shall
mm,
slide in due time. And it's such a poignant moment because the Spirit of God moves in a dynamic way.
mm,
People are convicted of their sin. And the sermon itself has such dramatic imagery
Mm-hmm.
that it did induce that sort of holy terror in the
Yeah.
hearers that night. People were crying out from the
Mm-hmm.
pews. And at one point, somebody had to stop and try to chill everybody out. He might not have finished the sermon. It's not clear whether he actually got through the whole of the sermon. But then they end up doing a lot of pastoral counseling that night, and a number of people were saved.
Mm-hmm.
So this is just one instance. It's important because the sermon itself became emblematic of the whole of the revival. But these
Mm-hmm.
things were happening all the time. And Edwards preached that particular sermon a couple different times with different results. But it was definitely a hallmark moment for the Great Awakening because of the dramatic effect that it had on its
Mm-hmm.
hearers in that occasion.
Yeah, that would have been an incredible time to witness the Spirit of God work. So, in your studies of Edwards and that time period, has that stirred up a longing and a desire within you to see the Spirit of God work in greater measure and greater degree, and to have a greater sense of the reality of His presence among your people, and to see the Lord pour out the Spirit of God?
Oh my goodness, yes.
I
That's
can't
one of the
imagine.
things that I love about Edwards the most is his desire for revival.
Mm,
Now, in fairness, God, who is the sole source of true revival, it
mm-hmm,
cannot be manufactured by men.
mm-hmm,
God pours out revival when, where, if, and how he means to do so by the pleasure of his own goodwill.
mm-hmm,
So as I long for revival, I know that there's nothing I can do to
mm,
actually make it happen.
yeah.
And Edwards himself, his views of revival are going to be high. He's an advocate for revival, prays for it, talks about it. It's the
Mm,
obsession of his pastoral life. But he will also be disappointed by
mm-hmm,
revival at times too. As the 1740s go on, Edwards realizes that some of the people that they thought were saved
mm-hmm,
probably ended up not being, that the church was at times in such differentiation on the topic that
mm-hmm,
sometimes they split, sometimes there were arguments, sometimes there were jealousies and factions and so forth.
mm,
But Edwards never gave up on the idea that the revivals were real.
mm-hmm,
Some people did not think so. They thought they were so much emotionalism.
mm-hmm,
But Edwards believes that what happened in those years was real and that the fruit was far greater than any falling off the branches that may have
mm,
happened several years later. And so yes, I love studying the Great Awakening because I
mm,
fully believe that God worked in men like George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards and Gilbert Tennant
mm,
and Samuel Buell and Aaron Burr Sr. and all of these guys that were enchanted by the revivals. I love it and I pray
mm,
for it all the time
yes,
in our church, especially on the Lord's Day. I pray that God would revive
yes,
his church again.
mm, mm, yeah. So Edwards, during that period, like you'd mentioned, there was a lot of controversy over the revivals, and obviously he was like right in the middle of it.
Hmm.
So from what I can recall, I can't remember the scale. There's a whole scale from moderate to radical or revivalist or whatnot. Um, and if I recall, Edwards actually became more moderate as time progressed, and his views of revival, I think his theological rationales started to become more clear and transparent in his own mind.
Hmm.
And so, would you say that's an accurate statement that he actually became more moderate with regards to his views on the revival as he aged and as the revival went on?
Yes, I think that's very accurate to say. And so, if we want to make a scale or a continuum, a guy like James Davenport would
Mm.
be kind of the extremist example who's going around saying that people's pastors aren't saved and basically calling people out of their churches and
Yeah.
telling people who's converted and who's not. And
Mm.
he ends up in a crazy moment
Yeah.
burning some things. And this is true story. James Davenport tears off his own pants and throws them into the fire. And it was at that moment that he kind of realizes, I think I might have gone a little too
Overdone
far.
it.
And he'll later repent for some of
Whoops.
yeah, I know. I hate when that happens, you caught
Uh,
up in preaching, throw your pants in the fire. True
uh,
story though.
yep.
And then on the other hand, on the other end of the
Mm,
continuum, you've got this guy, Charles Chauncey, who's
mm,
dubious from the first. He doesn't think it's real. He thinks it's all conjured up emotion. He thinks that what's happening is just people getting way out of control. But Edwards would be to the center right on that
mm,
continuum, wherein he is 100% an advocate of the revival, no
mm,
doubt. He'll never give that up.
mhm,
In all of his revival writings, including A Faithful Narrative, 1735, his Distinguishing Marks of the Work of the Spirit,
mm,
1740, his Religious Affection, 1746, he's constantly beating the drum
mm,
that the revival is an incredible work of God. However, he does see the extremes and the errors.
mhm,
And Edwards believes that that's intrinsic to revival,
yeah.
that all revivals have extremists and errors,
Mm,
because Edwards believes that Satan will immediately swoop in and try to mimic, to mock, and to denigrate what's happening in revivals.
mm,
And he thinks that's a satanic strategy to try to quench the Holy Spirit's fire during
mm,
times of revival. So Edwards will be an objective
mhm,
analyst, and he will, like if you read his book, Some Thoughts on the Revival, that's another one. I think that's
mm,
1742, if I'm not mistaken. Um, he'll tell you straight up what the errors are,
mhm,
and he'll go through them all one by one, and he'll say, this is real. This is not real. This
mhm,
is real. This is not real. This, we're not sure if this is real or not. He's completely honest
yeah.
about the revivals, but no question, he's an advocate, prays for it, wants it, and he wants
Mm.
it to come back when it's gone.
So, I mean, we think about that. You mentioned some thoughts on the revival, like with regards to his writings and some of the literature he produced. Which of his literature and which of his works did he produce in response to the revivals, and almost as an apologetic for? Um, and maybe that could lead us into like religious affections and so on.
Uh huh. Okay, so in terms of his revivalist materials, let's just tick through them. So, A Faithful Narrative is a description of the 1735 local revival. It's a shorter piece that was originally a letter that ended up being expanded in form by request from other ministers to hear more about what was happening.
Mm,
It was printed as well in Europe, and so Edwards sort of gets a international reputation as an expert in revival because he's told the story of what happened in Northampton in the Connecticut River Valley. When revival comes back in 1740, he's going to preach a sermon called The Distinguishing Marks of the Spirit of God,
hmm
in which he goes through what he believes from First John chapter 4 are real marks of real revival. And
mm,
basically he says there's five. A real revival will produce a love of God,
mm,
a love of Christ, a love of truth,
mm,
a love for one another, and then a hatred of sin, especially your own
mm,
sin. So Edward says if those marks are present, that's real.
mm,
That book will later be expanded greatly to become Religious
mhm,
Affections, where he's going to rewrite the whole thing and expand it by like 10 times.
mm,
And that's going to be his major work on the heart, or his understanding of conversion, 1746.
mm,
There's also another work called Some Thoughts on the Revival, which you mentioned a minute ago,
mm,
which is also a mature apologetic for the revivals, in which he does come across as slightly on the defensive,
mm,
because by this time some people are attacking the revivals as not real or inauthentic, and that's where Edwards is going to very objectively parse what's
mm,
happening, what is of the spirit, what is of man, what is not clear, whether it's the spirit or man, because some things could go either way.
mhm,
And that's going to be, I think, a really helpful work. And he's going to challenge people and say, okay, but come on, you've got to be in favor of revival, because this is how, the
yeah,
Lord works in sovereign ways, and nobody should resist the revivals. And so there's
mhm,
this undercurrent of kind of like questioning, like, come on, guys, who
yeah.
who who doesn't want this to be powerful? Why wouldn't
Mm.
you want that?
mm,
So those would be his major revivalist writings. Now there's other tracts and
mm,
shorter pieces and letters and so forth, but those would be the major ones.
mm. You know, it's amazing. You think about the giftedness of Edwards, and you think about God's providence and how God ordained that one of the most gifted men be right in the middle of this and be the one documenting his work. That in and of itself is incredible.
Mhm. Mhm.
You know, the Lord's purposes in having Edwards, this great mind, be the one that's documenting and describing and characterizing true work of God.
Mhm.
Um, I, th- why would you recommend? And I'd love to hear what you say on this. Why would you recommend for pastors today um, study religious affections and so because I think there's great benefit in studying those with regards to what a healthy church looks like and how do you know when God's working in a church?
Mhm.
You know,
Mhm.
how do you know when when the Spirit of God is sanctifying his people?
Yeah.
You know, you think about that and the need of pastors for encouragement that God is working in their churches and motivation to study religious affections and the distinguishing works of the Spirit. What would you say
Mhm.
on that, brother?
Well, they're just really edifying for one
Mm,
thing. I mean, for the sake of our own souls, I think reading a work like Religious Affections is excellent.
mm,
And most people consider it to be a true spiritual classic, even those people that don't, for instance, take up all of Edwards's Calvinistic leanings. So, ironically, you've got a guy like John Wesley, who's definitely
mm,
not a Calvinist, right? He's on
mhm,
the other side of that fence for sure. Him and Whitfield, they almost broke up their friendship about that. They
mm,
ended up patching it up later, but that's a pretty big issue. Well, even Wesley loves religious affections, and
mm,
he will eventually even edit his own sort of Methodist, stripped down Calvinistic version of religious affections just because he thought it was so good.
yeah.
And, whenever you've got a Christian book like that, that is
Mm,
really treasured by a lot of various people, like I'm a pretty hardcore Presbyterian, right? I love religious affections.
mm,
But I also know some Pentecostals and charismatics and
mm,
non-denominationals and Wesleyans that love religious affections too, because Edwards just has a real appreciation for the human heart.
yeah.
He knows our deceits, our weaknesses, but also the thrills of being saved by the glory of Christ.
Mm,
And the premise of the book is that true conversion really changes the heart.
yeah.
It changes what he calls the affections, which are
Mm,
not exactly the same thing as emotions, but
mm,
you get the point. There's the joy of the Lord. There's the fear of the Lord. There's the spirit of true contrition within
mm,
us. There's a desire for duty and obedience, and he just goes through all of these affections,
mhm,
and he talks about how stirring it is to have been truly regenerated by the Spirit and saved
mm,
by Christ, with a desire to love, serve, and honor Him in all things. And most people who read religious affections come away from it saying that was good. That
yeah.
is good stuff right
Yeah.
there.
So if
And
you're watching this, read religious affections.
yeah, yeah, that's a good one for sure. No question about it.
So you kind of touched on this briefly there. So how would you define a religious affection? I think I've heard it described as strong movements of the soul.
Yeah,
Something
so
similar to that.
very similar. An emotion is the common word today. The reason that they're not emotions is
Hmm.
because emotions are very transient. They're like
Hmm.
wispy clouds that are here for a moment and then gone. And you know as well as I do that you're in a good mood and then something happens and you're ticked off and then
Hmm.
you get bored and you're blasé and then you're stirred up or lazy or zealous and the mood changes all the time. Well, religious affections, we might say, are more like inclinations of the
Hmm.
soul or declinations, depending on your
Hmm.
perspective. So think more of magnets. A
Hmm.
magnet is drawn to
Yeah.
something always, or it's repelled by something, right? So an unsaved person
Hmm.
is going to be repelled from the holiness of God.
Hmm.
When an unconverted man thinks on the holiness of God, he wants not of it. He wants to flee, turn away, run away. He's like Adam who wants to jump in a bush or contrive some leaf-made clothing to
Mm,
hide himself from God. So that's an
mm,
affection because it's a
mhm,
declination away from the holiness of God. But when a person's saved, that magnetic force reverses to being compelled rather than
mm,
repelled. And so the truly saved person then loves the glory of God,
mm,
and they desire holiness, and they hate their sin, and they long for love
mm,
and forgiveness with other people. And those things in the saved soul are not transient based on today's mood.
yeah.
But while my mood may change, my inclinations and declinations don't change. They may
Mm,
be strengthened as I grow in sanctification, but it's not so wispy as emotions are. And so
mm,
Edwards is using this as a rubric to talk about real conversion.
mhm,
A truly converted person loves holiness.
mm,
They're not perfect, but they love it and they
yeah.
want it and they desire it. So that would be just an example of what he means by an affection.
It almost like as you're talking, I'm thinking it's almost like you're trying, like affections would be, you're trying to describe the senses of the regenerate part of man,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
um, and or that new ruling principle of life within us, um, towards or against certain things,
Correct.
um, and so, mm, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. You got it. You got it exactly.
Hmm. So the revival, when would you say the Great Awakening really started um, declining, I guess we could say?
It's definitely in decline by mid 1740s. So
Okay.
by the time we're in 45, it's definitely a different mood than it was in 42 over the course of those years. But again, like my ripples analogy with the
Mm-hmm.
pond in the stone in the pond, um, let's say you throw a stone in a pond and you see that first strong ripple moving outward. Yeah, but the water's still kind of
Yeah.
moving even for a while afterwards. And so the awareness of revival, the potential for other sub revivals to break out is still going to go on. In fact, we're going to see aftershocks of revivals all the way up until like the late 1750s, even. So Edwards dies in 58. Well, just a couple of years before that, at the new Princeton School, which is ostensibly replacing Yale, which replaced Harvard as the bastion of true Christian conservatism,
Mm,
they're still experiencing ripples of
mm-hmm.
revivalism even that late. So like Aaron Burr, who's the president of Princeton before Jonathan Edwards, is describing students going through awakening periods even that late. So we're talking, ripple effects
Mm-hmm.
well into the through the 40s into the 50s and possibly thereafter. And even too, when we get to the second Great Awakening, which is a much longer
Mm-hmm.
kind of strewn out event in the early 1800s, there's a sense in which they're still connected. You know, things are going
Mm-hmm.
to change dynamically. I think the second Great Awakening is less um, there's less veracity there than the first Great
Mm-hmm.
Awakening for various reasons, but they're still connected.
Mm-hmm. So when was so 45 is when we see this difference in the revival and Great Awakening. When was Edwards dismissed from Northampton?
Okay, so that happens in 1750. He's fired from the Northampton church. He had made a couple of pastoral mistakes a few different times where he begins to lose their trust a little bit. There's a lot that goes into this, and a couple of factors are these. First, Edwards has accumulated for himself some small town rivals, let's say.
Hmm.
Actually, they're sort of related to him, the Williams clan. He's going to lose their trust, and there's going to be tension between the Edwardses and the Williams for some time. This family is going to be like a thorn in his shoe that's going to keep
Mm,
coming back and pestering a bit. And so there's that. There's also a moment where Edwards makes a kind of a pastoral blunder, and in a moment called the bad book case, where Jonathan Edwards is actually kind of he's going to work on a church disciplinary matter amongst the teenagers and the young people. There's a midwifery textbook that's getting passed around by the young men that has some graphic pictures of female anatomy. And they're going to start talking about this and making fun of some girls. Edwards has no patience for that. So he basically calls out the entire youth group at church, names them all off, whether they're the instigators or whether they're the victims. And parents are going to be pretty mad about that. He wasn't clear who was being rude and who was the victim of the rudeness.
Mm,
So he makes all the parents mad because they said, he said their kids' names in church. So that's not good. Edwards also begins to really work on his writing career and probably should have visited his people more often. So he makes some kind of blunders in that he probably should have been visiting the widows and the sick a little bit more, loses a little
mm,
bit of respect there. But then the big break is when Edwards is going to try to change the communion policy at Northampton. Stoddard, his grandfather, had had sort of an open communion policy in which you were allowed to participate in the supper as long as you weren't openly scandalous in your life. Edwards wants to go back on that policy and make it tougher to come to the table. Edwards wants you to have to come first and profess being converted and then being permitted to the table. But unfortunately, the powers that be would not allow it. And that's the breaking point,
mm,
or at least that's what they use as the breaking point to finally get rid of Edwards. And then, after a series of council meetings and various congregational meetings, they end up firing him by a pretty strong congregational vote. And
mm,
he's out in 1750.
mm. And what does he transition to following that? And then he eventually ends up for a short presidency at the College of New Jersey, if I believe.
That's correct. You got that right. Again, your Edwards knowledge is very sharp. So there's an awkward year where Edwards is trying to figure out what he's going to do. He's got 10 kids. He's got the pastoral parsonage, the fields. The tension is going to brew with the church. After he's fired, ironically, they ask him to fill the pulpit, which got to be totally awkward. But for about a year, he's like, "All right, I'll keep preaching. You fired me, but whatever."
Wow.
So he'll come back and he'll preach even after his
Yeah.
farewell sermon. He'll still preach sermons to them. He has this crisis of faith, we might say, where he's not sure if he should go to Scotland and become a Presbyterian
Mm,
minister. There's a real desire in Virginia amongst the Presbyterians to
mm,
call him down there. Um, he's recruited for a couple things that he's not so terribly interested in, and he ends up being a missionary to the
mm,
Stockbridge mission. He presses further out west to basically the edge of the frontier at this point. He goes to Stockbridge, and there's where he serves that um, kind of a combined church, a white church and an Indian church together. And he's going to do that rather well for about 7 years between 51 and 50.
okay.
Yeah. And then it's at the very tail end of his life that he takes the presidency at Princeton, then called the College of New Jersey, wherein he will only be president for a few months before he ends up
Mm,
dying.
mm. Now, at what point in time in there does he um, start interacting with the young David Brainerd?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And was it when he was a missionary, or was that when he was that later on near the end of
No,
his
that's
life?
that's back at Northampton. So
Okay.
David Brainerd is a missionary who is he's ordained Presbyterian after some controversy that he goes through. And Brainerd, because he's another one of these new light revivalists, he's going to come to stay with Edwards. But it becomes obvious that Brainerd is really sick. In fact,
Mm,
he has tuberculosis, and his death sentence is practically already written. But Edwards thinks of Brainerd as something of a model Christian. He's
mm-hmm,
kind of the guy he's really been writing about in Religious Affections, a guy who's
mm,
been totally transformed by the love of Christ and willing to suffer and die for Jesus and so forth. And so Brainerd comes to convalesce at Edwards's house. In those days, pastors' houses, they had to be open at all times. They're kind of like part inn, part seminary, part hospital.
mm,
You just go to the pastor's house. And so Brainerd comes through, might have fallen in love with Edwards's daughter, Jerusha, although the evidence there is scant. But definitely they connected in a deep friendship. And Brainerd is going to end up dying from tuberculosis, as well as Jerusha.
Mm,
She dies too, unfortunately, but not before Edwards becomes really enchanted with Brainerd's lifestyle as a sell all for Christ
mm-hmm,
missionary in the wilderness. And Edwards is going to then talk to, by way of letter, John Brainerd, David Brainerd's brother, and he's going to basically get Brainerd's journals. He's going to edit them and publish them so that people can see what a true Christian looks like, according
mm-hmm,
to Edwards. Edwards is going to redact some of his depressive stuff.
mm-hmm.
There's certainly some evidence that Brainerd probably was depressed by today's psychological standards. And Edwards is going to edit those journals and then publish them. And interestingly, that's his most popular book that he
Mm.
wrote in his lifetime. That was his bestseller.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Yep.
And it's crazy to me because like I think about Edwards. I mean, I think about Brainerd, and you think about that young man, and he was not that well known during his life, but his influence just multiplied and multiplied and multiplied following his death because of the life and diary,
Yeah,
because of
definitely.
Edward's preservation and his propagation of his work. And all of a sudden, I I mean, it seems as though the Lord abundantly blessed Edward's endeavor in that work, because now all of a sudden all these people throughout time are coming into contact with this model of piety and godliness and holiness. And I think in some ways, like you're saying, it is the vision of Edwards and how he sees piety and true godliness, but we see it lived out in this brother, in David Brainerd, and that he actually, this was his life. And the Lord abundantly blessed that because it became so popular. I just think that's really, really incredible how much his influence multiplied following his death. And I think you see that oftentimes with individuals. That I think the same thing with McShane.
Hmm.
He had a short period, a short-lived ministry. There's not much to it, but his influence, because Bonner uh, preserved his memoirs and his work and his life and propagated the exact same thing. The Lord abundantly used it and multiplied his influence for the kingdom. Um, so,
Yeah, that's exactly right. So his life and diary of David Brainerd is not only going to be Edwards's best-selling book in his own lifetime, but it's also going to be probably one of the most important
mm,
missionary biographies that's ever written. Now, we might think of a guy like Jim Elliot,
mm,
more in 20th century, he is no fool who gives what he can't keep to gain what he can't lose. That sort of thing is being highly motivating. But all of these guys, like William Carey and Adoniram Judson and Robert Murray McShane and David Livingston, Gideon Hawley in Edwards' own day, all these guys are reading Brainerd's diary and they're seeing this example of a life fully lived for the glory of Christ.
mm,
His suffering in the wilderness and in the weather and alone and his persecutions and so forth. And then ultimately his success. I mean,
yeah,
Brainerd ends up leading not a huge amount of people, but dozens, we would say, maybe hundreds. But I don't want to overstate the case. But he has this harvest towards the end where he really has to press through adversity,
mm,
and then he sees the blessing hand of God in his ministry. And people read that diary and they thought it was just absolutely an incredible example of a life well lived to the glory of Christ, combined with the fate of his suffering and dying from tuberculosis, and his willingness to go home to eternity and be with the Lord. It's a really powerful story.
yeah, yeah. I believe David Brainerd said something to the extent of, "I love to live on the brink of eternity." And then I don't know exactly, you'll have to correct me, but Edward said something similar to, "I want to stamp eternity on my eyeballs."
Hmm.
And so you see this similarity between the two in their view of eternity and what is to come, their vision, their sight, what they're looking at, the reality that they are pilgrims. Um, so when you think about Edwards, what was his devotion like? I mean, what we might say his devotional life, his personal piety, his personal godliness and holiness. Could you just real briefly walk us through what that looked like and what his habits and practices were?
Hmm. Well, there's some modesty here on Edwards's part. For one thing, he doesn't talk about himself a lot.
Hmm.
He does have his journal or his diary from very young when he's in his early 20s, which he really doesn't carry that project out for very long. But even still, there, he's not talking about what he does every day, but
Hmm.
rather how his spirit is in ascending or descending, where he feels like he's growing or whether he's sinning and so forth. Um, Edwards spent a ton of time in his study, and so a lot of his devotional life is wrapped up in his studies and his writing projects. But there's also kind of this Puritan humility in which people did not openly discuss their private
Hmm.
prayer life. They called that the prayer closet, from the reference to the gospel where Jesus talks about going into your closet and praying. And so Edwards will not come out and say, like, yeah, I prayed 7 hours today or something like that. He
Hmm.
just won't really do that for you. But obviously, his whole life is steeped in scripture. And most of Edwards's devotional project is taken up in his theological musings, especially in his miscellanies, where he's constantly writing on theological and biblical topics.
Mm.
But we just have, as Edwards scholars, we're just so blessed because there's just so many volumes of Edwards's published and unpublished writings that any eager scholar can quickly latch on to a theme or a topic or a scriptural motif and find what Edwards has to say about that because he's
Mm.
just constantly writing and thinking about scripture.
Mm.
So if anybody's interested in furthering up some Edwards studies academically or otherwise, you can go into his miscellanies, which are again for free online at edwards.yale.edu. And you can just begin combing through hundreds of miscellaneous entries, which are paragraph length or page length or sometimes many page length thought experiments in which Edwards will trail out a thought to follow where it goes,
Mm.
often using those then later on to write his books. But he's just one of those people who's completely consumed with God and Christ and
Mm.
redemption and just constantly writing on these things all the time.
Isn't there one particular episode where he's because didn't he walk and then he would pen notes on the inside of his jacket? And didn't he
Yeah.
have one particular instance or occurrence where he had a great spiritual view of Christ? Or am I thinking Brainerd?
Um, no, I think you're correct. So you're right in that when he traveled, usually on horseback, because he couldn't read and write on a horse, he would often take pieces of paper and clip them to his jacket, one word,
Mm.
which would remind him then to go back and to fill out that subject later. I don't know why he did that, other than that these pieces of paper that he would pin to himself was just his best way of being able to do something while he's riding on a horse to get himself to remember a thought that he had. So he
Mm.
definitely did that. But you're also right that there is at least one moment where Edwards is alone in the woods and he's walking and praying and he has this glorious experience of Christ that he will kind of go back to
Hmm.
again and again throughout his life. And here's another recommendation for the listener. In 1740, I believe it is, big year for Edwards, big year.
Mm.
Actually, I want to look up the date of this. Aaron Burr is going to ask him about his testimony, and Edwards is going to write up what's called his personal narrative. I'm 100% sure this is in volume 16. And basically, this is Edwards's telling of his own conversion story.
Mm.
So if you want to hear Edwards in first person talking about his spiritual experiences, you can read his personal narrative. It's not very long.
Mm.
You could probably read it in one sitting or two, maybe. And Edwards will there take you through from his own perspective what happened in his own soul.
Mm.
And this is Edwards at his most personal, talking about his life, at least up to that point,
Mm.
about to the Great Awakening. And he will share, you know, what it is that the Lord did in his soul, including the instance that you're referencing.
Mm. I think that's one of the most, reading men like Edwards, Brainerd, McShane, and so many others, and the Puritans in general, reading about how they contemplated their own spiritual state and how they considered the landscape of their own soul and God's
Hmm.
work in their soul and their own personal experience of God's grace. It stirs up a longing within me to know more of that grace myself.
Yeah, me too.
And it's because you want there's it reminds me of Ephesians 3, where in Paul's grand prayer for the Ephesians, um, and this greater experience of God's grace. And it's just so encouraging, so stirring, so challenging. But also, I think that that's why we can have an affinity with so many of these men, because if we have tasted a little bit of this and they tasted of the same thing, um, we have similarities and likenesses because we've shared in God's work. We've shared in the grace of God. We've been benefactors, beneficiaries of the grace of God and the Spirit and His work in our life. I think it inclines our heart to these men. It wells up a desire in me to
Yeah,
know
me too.
more of God's grace.
Yeah, totally agree.
Mm.
Totally agree. And
So,
when we find ourselves barren at times, when we
yeah,
look in our own soul and we find that perhaps the flame is diminished a bit, it's good to go back on some of these great biographical sketches and find what motivation and encouragement might be there.
mm,
Maybe to have somebody that can rebuke us
yep,
or encourage us or call us alongside. I've always thought of Edwards
mm,
as being that for me in my life. There are other men that I look to, Calvin and so forth, and Luther to a lesser extent, Whitfield too. I like all
mm,
these guys, but Edwards is the most like my personality, I think, in that we kind of have this compulsiveness to be close to the Lord and to His Word, and our personalities are fairly similar. So I appreciate that about
mm,
Edwards, and I find that what he says is stirring.
yeah.
I find him convicting and encouraging and rebuking all at the same time, and I like that. I think that's good.
Lloyd Jones talked about how um, there was nothing better to humble a pastor following Lord's Day preaching than to sit down and read of Hal Harris and Daniel Rowland. And he said he'd sit down and read Whitfield. And he
Yeah.
said when he thought he'd done pretty good, he'd go and look at these men's ministry and it would shrink him.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it'd give him a proper perspective. And he said it helped bring about humility in his own life. But I
Mm.
think, like you're saying, it does the opposite as well. It stirs up and it fans the flame because we see what God can do.
Mhm. Mhm.
And we see the power of God at work through these men. Um, so many benefits in looking to godly historical figures. So, last thing here, as we think about Edwards and his life, his ministry, and we think particularly about his legacy, how has Edwards impacted the church over time, and how has Edwards impacted you personally? And you've explained some of that already.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but I guess that would be my last question here for you, or last two questions.
Well, first of all, it's been an amazing conversation. I appreciate it. It's been really great to talk about something that I love quite a bit. I think Edwards will be a long-standing tower to the
Mm,
church for many years. After he died shortly, some of his people that knew him or had heard of him did not think that his legacy was going to last.
mm,
They thought that the revivals were going to be forgotten, that Edwards was kind of trapped in his time. There was already a sense in which Edwards was seen as kind of backwards and old fashioned, especially with his insistence on Calvinistic orthodoxy.
mm,
And as the world in the Americas became more and more Arminian and even um, uh, universalist in some sense, Unitarian, they thought Edwards's theological convictions were going to become passe
mm,
and that his relevance would continue to diminish as every generation went forward and that he would be forgotten.
mm,
But that is not what has happened. What has happened instead is exactly the opposite.
mm,
That while Edwards was forgotten for a time, and there was probably a moment where his writings really could have been lost to history, um, instead he was rediscovered.
mm,
And men like Martin Lloyd Jones, who we've mentioned already, are at least partially to thank, as well as Gerstner and others,
mm,
for rediscovery of Jonathan Edwards and his power.
mm,
And what we've found is I mean, I've never thought of this before. It's a lot like the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, to be honest,
mm,
because we thought that it was going to show how far things had gone. But
mm,
no, the Dead Sea Scrolls showed how precisely and authoritatively the scriptures had been preserved by
mm,
God. Well, the same thing is true with Edwards. When we discover him, rather than seeing a guy who's completely outmoded and irrelevant,
mhm,
we see a guy who's extraordinarily powerful and relevant.
yeah,
And the reason he's sustained his relevance is because he is so doggone fixated on the glory of Christ
yeah,
and the authority of his word and the power of his spirit. And
yeah,
that will never become irrelevant. I'm preaching now a little bit, but that's never going to be irrelevant. And so
mm,
Edwards's legacy has actually grown
yeah,
since the mid 20th century. And I think because
mm,
of the availability of all the Edwards stuff that's out there and the
mm,
desire and hunger for the word of God, you're going to see over the next 100 years Edwards's tower get even taller. That
mm,
would be my prediction.
mm. Would it be fair to say, I don't know, I mean, it would seem as though Edwards is probably the most studied historical Christian figure. I don't know if that would be accurate, but it would seem like that would probably be the case.
I don't know either, and I'm not sure how we would know. I will say this though. One of the reasons why he's such a great study is because there's so much stuff.
Yeah.
And thankfully, we have a ton of Edwardsian material.
Mm,
Did you know, for instance, that if you go to Yale to the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library, there are still many sermons of Edwards's that have not been transcribed and digitized yet. A lot
uh,
of them are handwritten,
mm,
hard to read, and in
mm,
outline form with broken sentence structure and things like that. But somebody needs to get this stuff and to basically decode it and get it out there
yeah.
because there's still a ton of material that could be
Mm,
mostly sermons, but there's
mm,
still a lot of it that needs to be worked through. And even for the stuff that is out there,
mm,
Yale, here, let me real quick, I'm going to go over to edwards.yale.edu, the site that I've mentioned a bunch of times. So we've got 26 printed volumes of Yale editions, all of which are like 400 pages.
mm.
But then there is a total of 73 volumes, including fragments and sermons and so forth, that are only digital. And there's a lot of work for
Wow.
theologians and students to comb through some of that stuff.
That's crazy.
There's so many dissertations that could be written on Edwards.
Mm,
It's just mind blowing.
mm,
And thankfully, because he was a kind of guy that wrote stuff down, we've got
mm,
dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of his letters and his miscellaneous and so forth. So, for anybody really looking to delve into a historical figure, you can't get better than Edwards because the original source materials are in our hands.
yeah. So where if somebody came up to you and said, "Hey, I'm interested in learning about Edwards. I heard your podcast. I'd love to learn more. I've never read anything directly from him. Um, where would you recommend somebody start? And then could you also kind of tell us about anything you've written on Edwards and any projects you're currently working on Edwards that you'd like to promulgate?"
Sure. Okay. So First, if you want to be an Edwardian scholar, you have to balance original materials with secondary sources. So,
Mm,
what I mean by that is you got to read some stuff about Edwards and you got to read some stuff from Edwards. Those are your
mm,
two basic categories. About Edwards, you should probably start with one of the two great biographies.
mm,
That would be George Marsden um, or Ian Murray. Both of those two biographies are great. Marsden is a little bit more academic. Murray's is a little bit more spiritual. So pick your choice there. Besides that, you just start reading Edwards himself. Start with Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God,
mm,
or Heaven is a World of Love, or
mm,
Distinguishing Marks, or if you want to go ambitious, read Religious Affections.
mm,
But take turns reading things by Edwards and about Edwards. So that's how you be an Edwards scholar. And it's all out there, and
mm,
most of it's free. As for my own works, I have a book on Edwards' 70 resolutions called Holy Living, Jonathan Edwards's 70 resolutions for living the
mm.
Christian life. So I did that with Hendrickson. My dissertation, which I can't find it, it's probably somewhere here on the table, is called Theology of Joy, Jonathan
Mm,
Edwards and Eternal Happiness in the Holy Trinity. That's my main book on Edwards.
mm,
And then we're working on the Jonathan Edwards Study Bible with Thomas Nelson, which is going to
mm.
come out next year, 2026, which I can't wait for. That's going to be awesome.
So, how will that be one volume? Kind of like,
Yep, just like a study Bible,
okay.
just like any other study Bible you get. Only every note is going to be from Edwards or about Edwards,
Mm,
pointing back to his official works.
mm,
Tons and tons and tons of academic citations pointing you straight back to Edwards, so that you can go to where he talked about that topic.
mm,
And then we've written 100 or so essays that are going to go in the Bible
mm.
with fore matter and back matter and all that kind of stuff. It should be neat. I can't
Oh,
wait.
praise God.
Yeah.
That's really exciting. Pastor Everhard, thank you so much for your time, your wisdom, your willingness to meet with me and discuss this important topic. And we really would encourage anybody that's listening to do some of the stuff that, or visit the sites and look for the books and look for the resources, because this is edifying material. The Lord, I believe, will bless your endeavor to study Edwards to your soul. And so thank you so much for being here. Do you have any last words you'd like to say to listeners about your ministry or anything, life or whatnot?
No, that's it. I'd just be pleased to once again mention Gospel Fellowship
Mm.
PCA, our church here just north of Pittsburgh, as well as the seminary, RPTS, the Reformed Presbyterian Theological Seminary, rpts.edu. Come check us out.
To our viewers, if this resonated with you, we would love for you to join us in this work. You can connect with us online at christianheritagecenter.us. And you'll be able to find Pastor Everhard's information down in the comments below on this video. Until next time, friends, let's continue to honor, preserve, and learn from the heritage of godly figures in the past to better serve the church today. Pastor Everhard, thank you. And to our viewers, thank you so much. Blessings.